It's dawn, day 73. The air over Amida smells like burning wood, old blood, and something worse, the particular rot of a city that has been dying slowly for over 2 months. Inside the walls, somewhere between 80 and 120,000 people are packed together in a space never designed to hold them. Soldiers with wounds, they wrapped themselves, using strips of their own clothing because the medical supplies ran out weeks ago. Civilians who fled the countryside, with whatever they could carry, a sack of grain, a few coins, a child on each hand. Children who have never seen a day without Persian war drums in the distance, who have grown up in the compressed span of this siege, from something approaching normal into something that will mark them for the rest of their lives, however long or short those lives turn out to be. And now, in the gray half-light before sunrise, something shifts. A Roman counter-tower hastily built from salvaged timber and packed earth, weakened by weeks of Persian artillery fire, groans once. A deep structural sound, the kind that makes every experienced soldier nearby go very still. Then it collapses. The crash is enormous, shaking the ground, sending a cloud of dust and debris rolling through the streets below. And in the gap it leaves behind, in that one broken section of wall, the Persian soldiers are already moving. They pour through like water through a cracked dam, thousands of them. And the men of Legio V Parthica, who have held this city against the greatest army the ancient world has ever assembled, look at each other in that moment, and they know. 73 days of holding. 73 days of watching their friends die on the walls, of burying the plague dead in mass graves, when there was no more room in the cemeteries, of eating less and less as the grain stores dwindled. 73 days. And now they know it is over. Rome's most fortified frontier city, the city that was never supposed to fall, is falling. There is a young Roman officer in the chaos fighting his way through streets so crowded with bodies that the dead cannot fall to the ground. His name is Ammianus Marcellinus. He is terrified. He is also watching everything with the particular attention of a man who understands somewhere in the back of his mind that he may be the only person who survives this to tell the story. And 30 years later, sitting in Rome, he will write it all down in the most vivid first-hand account of battle to survive from the ancient world. This is the story of the Siege of Amida, a story about military genius and catastrophic incompetence, about betrayal from within and heroism without reward, about what happens when a great empire starts trusting politicians more than generals, about the price ordinary soldiers pay for the vanity of emperors, and about a single arrow fired on the wrong morning by a soldier whose name history never recorded that changed the course of the ancient world. If you're watching this for the first time, welcome. Drop a comment right now and tell me where you're watching from and what time it is there. I want to know who's here for this one, because the Siege of Amida deserves an audience. Hit the like button if you're already hooked, because we are just getting started. Now let's go back to the beginning. To understand what happened at Amida, you need to understand the world it existed in. And in 359 AD, the world was essentially 2 worlds. On one side, the Roman Empire, still the dominant force in the West, and Mediterranean, still projecting the image of invincibility that 4 centuries of conquest had built. But it's a different Rome than the one Julius Caesar ruled, or even the Rome of Marcus Aurelius a century and a half before. This Rome is Christian bureaucratic, divided between an Eastern court and a Western court, and increasingly run by emperors who are more comfortable in palaces than on battlefields. The machinery of empire is still enormous. The roads, the legions, the administrative apparatus, the tax system, the law, but it runs on institutional momentum more than on the inspired leadership that built it. The emperor in 359 is Constantius II, a man who inherited power rather than earning it, who spent more energy purging rivals than fighting enemies, who surrounded himself with court eunuchs and palace officials, and who had a particular talent for taking advice from the wrong people at the wrong time. On the other side, the Sassanid Persian Empire, and if you've been sleeping on the Sassanids, let me wake you up right now. These people were not some disorganized tribal confederation that Rome was casually beating back. They were a sophisticated empire with a professional army, a complex bureaucracy, a refined court culture, and a deeply held belief that they were the rightful heirs to the ancient Persian dominion that Alexander the Great had shattered centuries before. They had cataphract cavalry, heavy armored horsemen encased head to toe in iron scales, their horses likewise armored, who looked like something out of a fantasy novel and hit like a freight train in battle. They had war elephants from India used for shock assault and psychological terror. They had siege engineers of real skill men who could construct complex artillery and earthworks with the kind of precision that Rome had once monopolized. They were in every meaningful sense Rome's equals. In some areas, they were Rome's superiors. The frontier between these two civilizations ran through a place called Mesopotamia, modern-day Iraq, and it had been contested, burned, rebuilt, and contested again for generations. Along that frontier, Rome had built a chain of fortress cities. Nisibis, which had already withstood 3 Persian sieges, Singara, and Amida. Amida sat on a natural plateau on the west bank of the upper Tigris River, its cliffs dropping straight to the water on one side, its thick stone walls ringing the other 3. Emperor Constantius II had recently invested in upgrading those walls, a fact that proved enormously significant. Inside those walls was a fresh spring. Inside were granaries, armories, and the accumulated wealth of a regional commercial center. It was formidable. The Romans had never lost it. There was an institutional confidence about Amida that bordered on complacency, the confidence of a city that had never been seriously tested. But it was more than a military asset. Amida stood at the crossroads of 3 strategic corridors west toward Cappadocia and the Anatolian heartland, north toward Armenia, east toward the Persian core territories. Whoever controlled Amida controlled the conversation about who owned this part of the world. Lose Amida, and you lose the argument. Now let me tell you about the man on the other side of those walls. Because Shapur II is one of the most extraordinary figures in ancient history, and he genuinely does not get the recognition he deserves in the Western storytelling tradition. We spend enormous energy on Caesar and Augustus and Marcus Aurelius. Shapur II ran circles around all of them at their respective games for 50 years, and most Americans couldn't pick him out of a lineup. Shapur II became king of the Sassanid Empire before he was born. That is not a metaphor the Persian nobles facing a succession crisis with no living male heir reportedly placed the royal crown on his mother's pregnant belly and declared the unborn child king of kings. He reigned from 309 to 379 AD, 70 years, the longest reign of any Sassanid ruler in the dynasty's 4-century history. By the time of Amida, in 359, he had already been king for 50 years, half a century of learning the machinery of empire from the inside of fighting wars, and losing some and winning more of building alliances and breaking them when necessary. He did not waste those years. As a teenager, he personally led campaigns against Arab tribal confederations, raiding Persia's southern borders with such thoroughness that Arab sources would remember his name for generations as a terror figure. Then he looked east, where the Zionites, a powerful nomadic confederation related to the Hunnic peoples, were pressing into Persian territory. This was not a small problem. A 2-front war against them and Rome simultaneously was the strategic nightmare Shapur most needed to avoid. And here is where Shapur showed his true genius. He didn't just defeat them, he flipped them. After roughly 5 years of grinding frontier warfare from 353 to 358, he brought the Zionite king Grumbates to the negotiating table, not to extract tribute or humiliating terms, but to forge a genuine military alliance. Grumbates and his warriors would march west with Persia against Rome. In exchange, Persia recognized Zionite sovereignty and treated Grumbates as an honored equal. It was a piece of strategic diplomacy far ahead of what most ancient rulers managed. By 359, Shapur commanded a multinational coalition stretching from the Caucasus to Central Asia. Albanian cavalry, Saka's warriors renowned for archery, Kyanite horse archers under Grumbates, war elephants from India, the core Sassanid professional army, the Azadan cavalry aristocracy, the Savaran heavy horsemen, the royal Pushtigban household guard. A superpower strike force assembled with deliberate patience over years, and Shapur had something else: intelligence of a quality most ancient commanders could only dream of. Specifically, he had a man named Antoninus. Antoninus had been a Roman official, a senior quartermaster who managed military finances and supply contracts across the eastern provinces. He moved in the highest circles of the Roman military administrative establishment. He knew where every garrison was, how large it was, what it was equipped with, how long it could hold out, and crucially, the political relationships between senior commanders. He had also accumulated debts he couldn't pay. And when Roman creditors started applying legal pressure, Antoninus defected to Persia, taking his family. He brought everything: detailed troop dispositions, supply route maps, garrison schedules, locations of every significant fortification, and most importantly, an intimate understanding of the political dysfunction within the Roman command structure. Here is what I find genuinely fascinating and deeply infuriating about Antoninus. Roman sources describe him as brilliant. Genuinely brilliant, sharp, articulate, with an unusual talent for logistics, and an almost uncanny ability to anticipate Roman responses. He wasn't some bitter clerk spilling secrets out of spite. He was a sophisticated operator who made a cold, calculated choice about which empire was going to win. He was wrong about the long game. But in 359 on the ground in Mesopotamia, he was completely right about the short one. Antoninus told Shapur exactly how to invade. And Shapur listened to every word. The invasion plan was elegant. Bypass the hard fortresses Nisibis and Amida had both proven resistant to siege. Move fast, drive straight west into Syria, cut the heart out of Rome's eastern province before the imperial response could be organized. Shapur did not want a siege. He wanted a campaign of rapid maneuver, and he had the coalition to execute it. Which brings us to Rome's side of this disaster, and if there is a single villain in this story, it is not Shapur II. The Persian king was doing exactly what competent rulers are supposed to do, building alliances, gathering intelligence, planning, carefully executing boldly. No, the villain of this story is the Roman political system itself, and the emperor who embodied its worst impulses. The man who should have been commanding Rome's eastern defenses was Ursicinus. He held the title of Magister Equitum, Master of Horse, and was by a significant margin the most experienced and capable eastern commander Rome had available. He had spent decades in and around Mesopotamia. He knew the terrain the way a farmer knows his own fields. He understood Persian military doctrine and had fought against it directly enough times to have genuine tactical intuitions about how Sassanid commanders think. The eastern officers and frontier garrison commanders knew him, trusted him, and would follow him without hesitation. Constantius II didn't trust him. That is the entire story. Constantius II was constitutionally incapable of trusting powerful, capable generals because powerful, capable generals had a habit of becoming emperors, and Constantius II had watched enough of them do exactly that to be pathologically cautious. He had seen his own family members killed in succession crises. He had survived by being suspicious, and that same suspicion that kept him alive and on the throne was now about to kill 20,000 of his soldiers. So he gave nominal command to a man named Sabinianus. Sabinianus's primary qualification for this role appears to have been that he was not threatening, not charismatic, not the kind of general who might in a moment of crisis get raised on a shield by his soldiers and acclaimed emperor. He was, in the language of bureaucratic self-preservation, safe, and in the language of military effectiveness, he was a disaster waiting to happen. Ursicinus was left commanding only the limitani, the border garrison troops' professional soldiers, but static defenders, not the mobile strike force, needed to respond to a Sassanid invasion at full army scale. Ursicinus knew exactly what he had, and exactly what he needed, and they were very different things. As word spread of the Persian crossing, civilian panic erupted across the border provinces. Dispatch riders sent in all directions, farmers abandoning fields, roads clogged with refugees, and all the while the main field army sat with Sabinianus, waiting for orders from Constantinople that arrived too slowly to be useful. And then a young man rode too close to the walls, and everything changed. Let me set the scene very carefully, because the moment that triggered the Siege of Amida is one of those historical incidents that feels almost too dramatic to be real, except we have a first-hand account of it, written by a man who was standing on the walls when it happened. Shapur's army is approaching Amida, but not as a besieging force. The plan as designed by Antoninus calls for a display of force sufficient to intimidate the garrison into surrender or passivity, then a continuation of the march westward. The Persians are planning to march through. On the morning before the main army arrives, Grumbates the Zionite king. Shapur's most important recently acquired ally rides out with a reconnaissance party to inspect the Roman defenses. This is entirely standard practice. Senior commanders assess walls before a potential assault, look for weak points, estimate garrison strength. He brings his son. The young man was everything you'd want in a prince, tall, exceptionally good-looking, conspicuous, in fine armor. He was, Ammianus tells us, precisely a youth just come to manhood, the first bloom of a life that had every reason to continue for decades. He rode too close, a Roman ballista operator. One of the artillerymen stationed in the wall towers, whose entire job was to watch for exactly this kind of opportunity, tracked him, estimated the range, made the adjustments, and fired. The heavy bolt flew true and hard. It punched through the young man's bronze cuirass and deep into his chest. He was dead before he hit the ground. What happened next unfolded with the speed and violence of an ignited fuse. The Zionite warriors in the party scattered in immediate panic, then reversed almost simultaneously because they could not allow that body to be captured. In the warrior cultures of Central Asia and the steppe, the body of a fallen noble was not simply a corpse. It was a sacred object, the vessel of a man's honor, something that had to be returned for proper burial rites. If the Romans dragged it inside the walls, that was a violation too deep for politics to bridge. The battle that erupted around the fallen youth lasted the rest of the day. Both sides threw men into the struggle, Romans fighting down from the walls to reach the body Sionites, fighting back through a hail of Roman missiles. By the time nightfall ended, the body had been recovered, but the price in dead on both sides was substantial. Grumbates' grief was by all ancient accounts absolute. Here is a man who had fought his way to leadership of a powerful nomadic confederation, who had then fought a multi-year war against Shapur II and been honorably defeated, and who had then made the consequential decision to march his people to the other end of the known world to fight Rome. He had brought his son, his only son, the heir to everything he had built, because that is what warrior kings did. his son was dead, killed by the city they had planned to walk past. The funeral rites took days. The body was cleaned and burned on a funeral pyre in the ancient steppe tradition, the smoke rising above the Persian camp visible from Amida's walls. The ashes were gathered and sealed in a silver urn, destined to be carried back to the Zionite homeland for final burial. And then Grumbates made his position clear to Shapur in terms that were not negotiable. We do not move. Not one step. Not 1 foot toward Syria. Not until Amida is dust, and the men who killed my son are dead. Shapur was suddenly in a political bind no amount of planning had prepared him for. He had spent 5 years and considerable Persian blood convincing Grumbates to become an ally. The Zionite cavalry was not peripheral, it was essential to the speed and flexibility that made his entire campaign concept viable. Leaving Grumbates behind bitter and publicly dishonored was not just a military problem. It was a political signal to every other member of the coalition that Shapur would use them and discard their concerns when convenient. That signal he could not afford to send. So Shapur, the man who had designed his entire campaign around avoiding exactly this kind of siege, turned his full army toward the walls of Amida. I want to stop here and make a point that gets overlooked in most accounts. Amida was never supposed to happen. Shapur's entire strategic plan was built around avoiding it, and the person whose decision actually forced this entire catastrophe, who caused 73 days of siege, 30,000 Persian dead, 20,000 Roman dead, and the eventual domino collapse of Rome's eastern frontier, was an anonymous Roman artilleryman doing his job on an ordinary morning. History does not record his name. He probably didn't survive the siege himself. But his one well-aimed shot echoed for decades. That is the kind of thing that should make anyone humble about how causation actually works in history. The morning Shapur's full army arrived before Amida is described by Ammianus in one of the most cinematically powerful passages in ancient military writing. And I say this as someone who has read a great deal of ancient military writing. And when the first gleam of dawn appeared, everything so far as the eye could reach shone with glittering arms, and mail-clad cavalry filled hill and dale. Try to visualize that from the perspective of a Roman soldier on the wall. You've been awake since before dawn, because the night watch never really let you sleep, and you're standing on cold stone looking east as the sun comes up. And as the light grows, you realize that what you thought were shadows on the hills are not shadows. They are soldiers. As far as you can see, every ridge, every valley floor, every approach road, every piece of open ground, there is nothing but the reflected light of Persian weapons. Swords, spears, the polished iron scales of cataphract armor, the bronze fittings of war elephant harnesses. 100,000 points of light, and every one of them is pointed at you. Shapur rode at the front. He wore, instead of his traditional crown, a golden helmet fashioned in the shape of a ram's head set with precious stones. Ammianus notes this in vivid detail. There has been subsequent historical debate about whether the figure at the front was actually Shapur himself or possibly a senior Kidderite commander named Peroz, since the ram's head helmet matches Kidderite rather than Sassanid royal iconography, and Ammianus writes that the soldiers were shouting what sounds like Shahanshah Peroz, King of Kings Victorious, which some historians read as a title for a different man. Whether it was Shapur or his most exalted ally at the front, the theatrical effect was identical. This was power made visible, wealth made weaponized, confidence made manifest in iron and gold and living flesh. He rode up to the gates and sent emissaries to demand surrender. The Romans refused. And then in what must rank as one of history's most personally reckless acts of military theater, whoever was leading that army rode close enough to the walls that defenders could identify him clearly, and Roman archers immediately tried to kill him. He retreated, and from that moment the assault was personal. The deployment was systematic and total. Albanian cavalry sealed the northern approach. The Sakas of Sakistan covered the west alongside the war elephants. Grumbates and the Kayanites took the eastern approaches along the Tigris. Shapur himself, with the royal Pushtigben household cavalry, the most elite unit in the Sassanid military, anchored the south, near the main gate complex. Amida was surrounded. Completely. Without gaps. Without possibility of resupply or reinforcement. Whatever happened inside those walls from this point forward, it was going to happen without help from outside. Inside the walls, the defenders processed this reality with a clarity that Ammianus captures in one of the most honest sentences ever written about being trapped. They had given up on surviving. They were fighting for how they would die, and for what story that death would tell about who they were. Think about what that kind of resolution does to a fighting force, men who are no longer calculating survival, only the cost they will extract. Think about that the next time someone tells you Roman soldiers were just following orders. Shapur opened with what any competent general would attempt. First, a fast, overwhelming assault designed to break the garrison psychologically before they had time to settle into a sustainable defensive rhythm. Persian siege towers, massive wooden constructions on wheeled platforms built to overlook the walls and allow archers to fire down, while infantry advanced behind were rolled forward on multiple axes. Infantry massed behind them. The war drums started. It failed completely. Roman scorpions, torsion-powered bolt-throwing artillery of considerable range and accuracy mounted in fixed positions on towers and wall walks began firing at the siege towers long before they reached effective assault range. The bolts they threw were heavy iron-tipped shafts, capable of punching through light timber at significant distances. Several towers were set alight by incendiary projectiles. The fires spread in the dry summer air, and towers that had taken days to construct burned in minutes. The first assault, which Shapur had designed to end the siege before it properly began, collapsed in smoke and burning wood, and the noise of Persian units pulling back from the walls. But while the main assault was failing at the walls, something far more dangerous was happening behind them. A Roman renegade, a deserter who had slipped out before the siege fully closed, someone who knew the city's infrastructure intimately, had guided a company of 70 elite Persian foot archers to a specific location, an underground passage running close to the Tigris riverbank on the southern wall. This was a tunnel or conduit that Antoninus's intelligence had flagged as a potential vulnerability. The 70 archers came up inside a tower on the southern wall. Positioned perfectly elevated above the streets, they began firing precision shots into the city's interior in coordinated timing with Shapur's general assault from outside. An inside-outside attack of real sophistication, and for several desperate hours it genuinely threatened to break the defense. The Romans responded with characteristic controlled violence. They stormed the tower from the inside, fighting up stairwells too narrow for the Persians to use their bows effectively. Hand to hand, floor by floor, they drove upward. The archers fired until they had no arrows left. Then the Romans killed every single one of them. Two things were now clear to anyone watching. First, Shapur had intelligence specific enough to know about an obscure underground passage in a city he had never previously besieged. Antoninus's knowledge was being directly operationalized. Second, and more important for everything that followed the garrison of Amida, was not going to psychologically collapse under pressure. They were experienced professionals who had trained for exactly this scenario. They were scared, but they were very, very good at their jobs. After the failure of the initial assault and the loss of the tower gambit, Shapur shifted to a slower, more systematic approach. And this is where the siege became genuinely fascinating from a military engineering perspective, because both sides turned out to be remarkably creative under extreme pressure. Persian engineers began constructing massive earthen mounds against the walls. The logic was simple: if you can't knock the walls down, build a ramp over them. Pack enough compacted earth against the wall's base, and you create an inclined ramp that infantry can walk up, cresting the wall from a position of near equality with defenders, rather than attacking straight-up vertical stone. It was a technique with deep roots. Alexander had used similar approaches at Tyre. Assyrian armies had done it centuries before. The Persians were good at it. The Romans responded with a solution that was almost comically stubborn. They built higher mounds from the inside. Every load of earth the Persians piled against the outside, the Romans answered by piling earth against the inside, maintaining their internal elevation above whatever the attackers were building outside. Then they constructed counter towers on top of their internal mounds, so Roman defenders were always looking down at Persian soldiers. It was an engineering duel conducted at geological slowness, weeks of manual labor, thousands of man-hours of digging and carrying and packing earth, while people died every day in the smaller skirmishes that never stopped. At the western approach, Shapur deployed his war elephants. These were not small forest elephants. These were large Indian animals trained from birth for warfare, armored with thick leather and metal plates, guided by experienced mahouts. Used primarily for shock and terror, their bulk could shatter infantry formations, and their psychological effect on soldiers who had never seen them was considerable. The Roman response was to hurl fire. Not arrows dipped in tar, actual burning bundles, flame pots, anything that would ignite against elephant hide. Elephants have a profound dislike of fire, and the animals panicked. Panicking war elephants are not merely ineffective, they are dangerous to everyone, including their own side. Persian formations behind them had to scatter to avoid being trampled by their own assets, and the western assault degenerated into chaos. Shapur personally led cavalry charges against the gate complexes, something Ammianus notes several times, with a mixture of military respect and incredulity. The Persian king was not conducting this siege from a comfortable tent at safe distance. He was in the assault, his elite cavalry behind him, close enough to the walls that defenders could see him clearly. You have to respect that even from the opposing side. Whatever you think about his cause, Shapur II was not a coward. Here is one of my favorite moments in this entire story, and I want to give it the space it deserves, because it illuminates something essential about the difference between soldiers who fight from orders and soldiers who fight from identity. Among the legions concentrated in Amida were 2 Gallic units. In 359 AD, that means Romanized soldiers from the Rhine and Moselle frontiers, men of predominantly Frankish and Germanic ancestry, whose people had been integrated into the Roman military system for 2 or 3 generations. They spoke Latin. They carried Roman equipment. They followed Roman military doctrine. But they also carried something else, a warrior culture genuinely separate from the Mediterranean Roman tradition, an ethos that placed enormous value on personal courage demonstrated in visible, risky public action. Sitting behind a wall watching the enemy was not how these men understood military honor. For days, weeks, they watched through the battlements as Persian raiding parties swept through the countryside, visible from Amida's walls, driving Roman civilian prisoners back toward the Persian camp. Men and women in chains, farmers whose entire lives were those fields. People who had been promised safety by the empire and were now being marched east into Persian slavery, while the army that was supposed to protect them stood on a wall and watched. The Gauls, Ammianus tells us with memorable specificity, gnashed their teeth like wild animals. That is not a metaphor. That is a description of men in a state of barely contained fury. They went to their commanders and stated their request with characteristic directness: let us go out. Tonight, after dark, let us hit them. The military calculus was unambiguous. You do not conduct a sortie against an army of 100,000 when you have a few hundred men available for the operation. The odds are not unfavorable, they are simply laughable. The risk of losing your sortie force entirely, of opening the gates and never closing them again, of triggering a general assault at the worst possible moment, was real and obvious to any professional soldier. The Gauls were genuinely not interested in the odds. Command gave permission. Historians have speculated about whether this was because the commanders understood the morale value or because they recognized that men in that state of fury are a danger to unit cohesion if their energy has nowhere to go. Whatever the reason, permission was granted. And that night, several hundred Gallic warriors moved to a gate, waited for complete darkness, and slipped out into the Persian camp. What they did in there was remarkable. Ammianus says a slight sound gave some warning to Persian sentries, and the alarm was raised before the Gauls reached their deepest intended penetration. But they had already reached the outer camp lines, and when the alarm went up, rather than turning and running, they turned and fought. They inflicted heavy casualties on the Persian soldiers who came at them in the darkness and confusion. And then, this is the part I find genuinely extraordinary, they withdrew. In good order, with their unit cohesion intact. Several hundred men, who had just hit a 100,000-man army in the dark, came back through the gates as a coherent military unit. That is not just bravery. That is bravery combined with discipline and training of a very high order. Night operations are where unit cohesion collapses most easily, where men scatter and get separated. The Gauls didn't scatter. They hit hard, took their victories, and came home. It remains one of the most impressive small unit actions of the ancient world. I think about this moment in parallel with what was happening simultaneously outside the walls. Ursicinus was somewhere in the Mesopotamian hills, composing yet another urgent message to Sabinianus, describing again the specific relief operations he could conduct with the forces available to him. Night raids on the Persian perimeter, supply runs through mountain passes, diversionary attacks on Sassanid logistics, and Sabinianus was again sitting on his hands waiting for Constantinople. Inside the walls, nobody was writing imperial dispatches about simply did the thing because they could not tolerate doing nothing. Outside the walls, the institutional mechanism of the Roman Empire ground forward. And the city burned. By the 10th day of the siege, something worse than Persian arrows had come to Amida. To understand what conditions inside the city actually felt like, you have to do the mental work of imagining 120,000 human beings in a space ancient Amida was built to hold maybe 15 or 20,000. Every building occupied beyond capacity. Every courtyard and public square appropriated for shelter. The streets, which in any functioning city are passageways between buildings, had become living spaces in their own right. People sleeping against walls, cooking over small fires, wherever they could find fuel, using whatever open space existed, as combined kitchen, hospital ward, and latrine, because sanitation infrastructure was never designed for this population density. The food situation was manageable barely because reinforcement before the siege had included significant supply stores. But manageable barely is not comfortable. And the combination of caloric restriction, physical exhaustion from constant watch duty, and fighting psychological stress from being trapped, and the filth that accumulates when sanitation infrastructure is overwhelmed, all of this created the precise conditions in which epidemic disease thrives. Ammianus describes the medical situation with the uncomfortable directness of a man who was there. Men with arrow wounds lying in doorways because there was no room in any building and no physician available. Soldiers trying to remove arrows from their own bodies because there was no one else to do it, sometimes successfully, more often killing themselves in the process by working the barb deeper or triggering uncontrolled bleeding. The dead lying in the streets not from neglect, but because there was genuinely no room to move them, no personnel to carry them, no ground outside to bury them. And because the dead could not fall, the press of living bodies held them vertical. This is the image Ammianus records with the quiet horror of a man who will never forget it, a soldier killed by a sword, cut straight through the head, held upright by the crowd, unable to fall dead and standing. Into these conditions came plague. What disease exactly cannot be diagnosed from ancient descriptions with certainty epidemic fever spreading through an overcrowded, malnourished population under acute stress could be several pathogens. But it moved fast, and it killed people who had survived the fighting. The count of the living dropped in ways that had nothing to do with Persian arrows. And then, improbably, it broke. Ammianus attributes the end to a light rain, a sudden summer shower that cooled the air and dampened the accumulated biological material in the streets. Modern epidemiologists would recognize several possible mechanisms: reduced airborne transmission in humid conditions, dilution of waterborne contamination. The psychological effect of weather change on people whose mental state was borderline. The defenders took it as divine intervention, and perhaps they weren't entirely wrong about the timing. The plague ended. The garrison that had been shrinking from disease as well as battle stabilized. The fight could continue. I keep returning to this plague episode because it captures something purely tactical histories consistently undervalue. The real battle in that city for 73 days was not just against Persian siege towers, it was against despair, against the temptation to look at the situation clearly and conclude that rational men would surrender, against the compounding weight of each piece of suffering until the accumulated total becomes unbearable. The garrison of Amida faced every form of that pressure simultaneously: military, physical, medical, psychological, and they held. That deserves more than footnote treatment. Around the midpoint of the siege, something remarkable happened that pauses the narrative of unrelenting violence and reveals something genuinely interesting about both sides' understanding of war and its limits. A Persian noble of high rank fell in battle during one of the wall assaults. Shapur, observing the customs of his culture with the seriousness great rulers typically bring to such matters, requested a truce from the Romans, a cessation of hostilities for 7 days to mourn the dead. No combat, no bombardment, 7 days of silence. The Romans agreed, without hesitation. I want to sit with this for a moment because it is genuinely strange from a purely utilitarian military perspective. These are two forces that have been killing each other for weeks. They speak different languages, practice different religions, and are fighting for genuinely incompatible claims over territory. And when one side says, in effect, we need to stop and grieve, the other side says yes, not because they had to, not because they expected anything in return, but because certain things are recognized across cultural boundaries as requiring acknowledgement. 2,000 years before the Geneva Conventions, there was something in these men that understood that even enemies bury their dead. Ammianus uses this pause to give us a rare window into Shapur's private state of mind, which it turns out was considerably less confident than his public performance suggested. The king was troubled. He had already lost enormous numbers of men. The city that was supposed to be a 2-day detour was consuming his entire campaign. He carried memories of previous failures at Nisibis 3 times, where Persian forces had bled profusely against Roman walls and gone home with nothing. He understood better than his generals and court poets were writing that Amida might yet hold. The Romans used the 7 days with professional efficiency. Damaged sections of wall were repaired. Ammunition for artillery was redistributed. The wounded who could be saved received whatever medical attention was available. Food was redistributed more carefully. People slept real sleep, not the half-conscious vigilance of previous weeks. The garrison entered the resumption of the siege in meaningfully better condition than the day the truce began. Then the 7th day ended. Shapur gave the signal, and the mounds grew higher. I need to spend more time on Ursicinus, because I think he is the most important figure in this story, who gets the least attention, and his situation tells us more about the structural collapse of Roman military effectiveness than any single battle outcome could. Ursicinus spent the entire 73 days of the Siege of Amida watching from the outside. Let me be precise about what this means. He could see the smoke rising from the city from positions in the hills. He could hear the distant percussion of the war drums and artillery on clear days. He received with agonizing delay reports from scouts about the siege's progress. He knew what was happening. He understood exactly what it required. And he could not act, not because he lacked courage, not because he lacked ideas, not because he lacked even the resources to at least complicate the Persian situation, but because Sabinianus would not authorize operations, and the imperial command structure required that authorization. Let me be specific about what Ursicinus was proposing, because vague gestures at military alternatives are easy to dismiss. He proposed sending light cavalry and specialized skirmisher units, forces he actually commanded through mountain passes south of the main siege area, to attack the Persian logistics train. Shapur's army of 100,000 men required enormous daily quantities of food-water fodder for horses and material. That supply chain stretched back across the Tigris into Persian territory, and it was not being adequately protected because Shapur had committed essentially all available forces to the investment of Amida. A competent raiding force operating against that supply chain would have forced Shapur to divert troops from the siege to protect it, reducing pressure on the walls and buying time. This was not a moonshot plan. It was standard operational doctrine for exactly this scenario. Sabinianus refused. Explicitly, repeatedly in writing. He was waiting for instructions from Constantius II. Constantius was in Constantinople, receiving messages that were days old by the time they arrived, making decisions based on a picture of the situation that had already changed multiple times before his authorization could travel back to Mesopotamia. The authorization Sabinianus was waiting for either never came or came too late to be acted on. Ammianus's portrait of Sabinianus is savage, and I believe it is accurate. He describes him clinging to the religious shrines near his headquarters, performing elaborate rituals and prayers as a substitute for military leadership he was unwilling to provide. I don't read this as Ammianus saying Sabinianus was pious. I read it as Ammianus saying Sabinianus was hiding, using religious observance as cover for the decision not to act, because acting would mean taking responsibility for consequences, and taking responsibility for consequences was something Sabinianus was constitutionally unwilling to do. After Amida fell, Constantius II needed someone to blame. The court process was efficient and dishonest. Ursicinus was charged with failure to defend the eastern frontier. The charges were eventually dropped when enough senior officers made clear they would not be party to a conviction, but the message was unmistakable. In this, Rome results were demanded and resources withheld. You were expected to succeed and prevented from succeeding simultaneously. The man who had been denied every tool necessary to do his job was put on trial for not doing it. I think about Ursicinus in purely modern terms sometimes. He is the middle manager who sees exactly what's going wrong, knows exactly how to fix it, is denied every tool he needs to fix it, and then gets fired when the thing breaks. He's not a rare type in history. He is remarkably common in the history of large organizations. The rarity is not the Ursicinus. It's the organization that can recognize what it has before it's too late. Rome could not do that. It would prove over the next century that it could not learn to do it. The empire died of Sabinianus's, not Shapur's. I want to be very direct about that. Every history that explains Rome's fall by pointing to the Huns, or the Visigoths, or the economic collapse is describing symptoms. The disease was already present in 359 in that exchange of messages between Ursicinus and Sabinianus, in the fundamental inability of the system to put the right person in charge and trust them to do their job. Day 72. The siege has consumed over 10 weeks. Both armies are exhausted in very different ways, the Persians, with the slow drain of attrition against a defense that refuses to quit the Romans, with the accumulated weight of deprivation and loss, and the knowledge settled into the bones now that no one is coming. The Persian mounds are enormous earthworks of impressive scale, built over weeks of labor by thousands of men. Against multiple sections of the wall, those mounds have risen to within touching distance of the Roman battlements. The Romans' internal counter-mounds have kept pace mostly, but the internal counter-towers, the hastily built structures erected on top of their own mounds, are not professional military construction. They were built under siege conditions by exhausted men with whatever timber and stone could be salvaged from inside the city. Some of them have been standing for weeks under the regular punishment of Persian artillery fire, and they are not in good shape. On day 72, under a fresh bombardment from Persian siege engines, one of those counter-towers fails catastrophically. Not just cracks, fails the kind of structural collapse that happens when compounded damage finally exceeds the tolerance of a compromised load-bearing element. It comes down hard, and when it comes down it brings a section of the underlying Roman wall with it. The gap is not large. In a less desperate situation it might be manageable. But the Persian mound outside that section of wall has been built to exactly the height of the battlements, which means Persian infantry can step from their earthwork onto the Roman wall walk without climbing anything. They surge. Every Persian soldier near that section of the perimeter, who has been waiting for this moment for 72 days, throws himself toward the gap. Romans converge from every available position to defend it. What follows is the kind of combat that military historians describe with clinical terminology, close-quarters fighting in a confined breach, but which was in lived experience a continuous several-hour nightmare of men killing each other at arm's length in a space too small to maneuver in, where the only tactical variable is how many warm bodies you can feed into the gap before the other side's warm bodies run out. The Romans hold the breach for hours, longer than should have been possible given the disparity in numbers. They hold it with the particular ferocity of men who have nothing left to calculate and nothing left to lose. If you ever find yourself wondering what fighting with everything you have actually looks like, the men defending that breach on day 72 are your answer. But there are too many Persians, and there are not enough Romans left. The wall breaks. Persian soldiers stream through not a trickle, but a flood, hundreds at a time, spreading through streets they have spent 73 days trying to enter. The defense ceases to be a military operation and becomes what historians call a final stand, small groups of soldiers defending specific buildings and intersections, buying minutes rather than hours, with no expectation of surviving the effort. What followed inside Amida, I am not going to dwell on extensively because Ammianus doesn't, and I think he made the right call. The massacre was, in his precise word, promiscuous, undiscriminating, making no distinction between those who fought and those who hid between soldiers and the civilians who had sheltered in the city throughout the siege. Comes Ammianus, the man who had commanded the garrison, who had held this city together for 73 days through every conceivable form of attrition, who had made decision after decision in the impossible situation of a siege he was never going to be relieved from, was captured alive. Shapur had him crucified. His surviving senior officers were crucified alongside him. It was a deliberate statement. This is what happens to men who make us work this hard for 73 days. 20,000 survivors of the civilian population were bound and formed into march columns. They walked east across the Tigris through Mesopotamia into the Persian heartland. They were resettled in Khuzestan, a province in southwestern Persia, far from anything familiar. Their names, their stories, their children absorbed into Persian civilization and lost to Western historical memory. Most of them never came home. Ammianus got out. One day before the final breach, he is somewhat vague about the exact mechanism, suggesting it was chaotic, and not entirely planned. He made it through the Persian perimeter and covered 15 miles to Roman-controlled territory before the city formally fell. He eventually made his way to Melitene, and then back to Antioch, carrying nothing but his memories and the mental notes of everything he had witnessed. He was 29 or 30 years old. He had just survived one of the most brutal siege experiences recorded in ancient history, and he had the clarity to understand even at that age that what he had witnessed mattered, that someone needed to write it down with the precision and honesty it deserved, and that he might be the only person both qualified and positioned to do it. 30 years later, he did. When the dust settled at Amida, it is worth asking with genuine rigor what had actually been accomplished. Shapur II had on the ledger of stated objectives 1. A major Roman frontier fortress had been taken, its garrison destroyed, its population deported, its symbolic value as the anchor of Rome's eastern defense structure eliminated. He had demonstrated to every other Roman frontier city that the walls were not sacred, and the empire was not going to save you. He had satisfied the blood obligation to Grumbates and preserved the coalition. These were real achievements. But Shapur himself and Ammianus is our source for this, which means we're seeing it through a filter, but the detail is specific enough to be credible, was privately not celebrating. He was troubled. He was doing the math his public posture required him not to do in front of his army, and the math was not flattering. Persian casualties at Amida were enormous. The figure of 30,000 dead comes from Roman sources, and while Roman sources had incentive to inflate enemy casualties, the scale was real enough to disturb the man who incurred them. He had spent his most valuable military resource, the fighting effectiveness of his coalition, on a city he had never intended to besiege. More critically, the campaign season of 359 was gone. The summer when armies could move and supply and fight effectively had been consumed by Amida's walls. Syria, the actual objective that Antoninus's intelligence had identified and Shapur's entire invasion plan had been designed to reach, was still Roman. The Anatolian heartland was still Roman. The strategic position of Persia relative to Rome had been improved, yes, but not transformed. Shapur had won the battle and paid for it with the campaign. He halted operations for the winter and withdrew east. He would be back. But the moment of maximum Persian strategic advantage, the moment when a fast campaign might have caught Rome so badly off balance that the response was incoherent, that moment had passed. The anonymous Roman artilleryman who shot the prince of the Zionites on a random morning had, in a very real sense, saved Rome's eastern provinces. He just didn't live to know it. What the Siege of Amida set in motion was a cascade of downstream consequences that ultimately proved more damaging to Rome than the loss of the city itself. In 360, Constantius II was staring at a Persian frontier that had just demonstrated its vulnerability in the most public and humiliating way possible. He needed reinforcements in the east. The obvious source was the Western army, specifically the Gallic forces under his cousin Julian, who had spent the previous 4 years winning a series of impressive victories against Germanic tribes on the Rhine frontier, and whose soldiers were among the best trained in the empire. Constantius issued the order Julian was to strip 2 of his best legions and send them east, Specifically, many of the Gallic troops were to be transferred to the Persian front. The Gallic soldiers refused. Not informally, not through grumbling and foot-dragging, but formally and collectively. These were men who had enlisted with specific contractual understandings about their service. The Roman military had long operated with such agreements. Many had been recruited with explicit promises they would serve on the Rhine frontier and not be sent east. Constantius's order broke those promises in writing, and the soldiers knew it. They assembled in the city the Romans called Lutetia Paris, and in a ceremony borrowed from their Germanic ancestors they raised Julian on a shield and proclaimed him Augustus, not Caesar, his junior rank. Augustus, the full emperor. And Julian accepted. This is the direct line from Amida to near civil war. The same Gallic troops who had been inside Amida, gnashing their teeth at Persian raiders who had slipped out at night to hit a Persian camp because they could not tolerate inaction, those men or their colleagues were now refusing an order that violated their enlistment agreements because the empire had demonstrated it would use them without regard for its own commitments. The imperial system had failed them at Amida when it refused relief. It was failing them again by attempting to break promises. They had reached the end of their patience. Constantius prepared for civil war. The empire that could not authorize Ursicinus to conduct night raids against Persian supply lines was now preparing to send the full Eastern field army against the most effective military commander Rome had produced in a generation. Fate or God, or the accumulated stress of a life spent in paranoid power intervened. Constantius fell ill in late 361 and died, leaving Julian as sole emperor without having to fight for it. The civil war was averted by biology, but the fracture was real. Julian's Persian campaign of 363 deserves its own full video, and it will get one, but the thread from Amida is too direct to skip. Julian was everything Constantius was not: decisive, willing to delegate to capable subordinates, personally brave, and genuinely committed to restoring Roman military effectiveness after years of political decay. He assembled the largest Roman army in decades, conservative estimates at 65,000 men, and in the spring of 363 moved down the Euphrates toward the Sassanid capital at Ctesiphon. The campaign started brilliantly. Engagement after engagement won. His logistics were well managed, his generalship aggressive. He reached Ctesiphon. He won a tactical battle outside its walls. He was briefly standing at the gates of the Persian capital. And then he made the decision that killed him and destroyed everything those soldiers had built. He could not take Ctesiphon. The walls were too strong, and Shapur was refusing to come out and fight a decisive engagement. Julian decided to abandon the river route and strike east across the Tigris into the Persian heartland. To prevent his river fleet from falling into Persian hands, he ordered it burned. 65,000 Romans were now on the wrong bank of a major river in hostile territory, with no water route home. Shapur had implemented a scorched earth policy that stripped the land of food. The retreat was catastrophic. The Persians harassed the column constantly, not with the decisive battle that Julian wanted, and Shapur refused to give, but with the relentless harassment of cavalry and the exhausting pressure of never being able to stop moving. On June 26, 363, in a skirmish near Samarra, Julian was struck by a spear in the flank. It penetrated his liver. He died that night. Who threw the spear has never been established. Persian warrior. Roman soldier with a grievance. Friendly fire. Christian fanatic taking the opportunity to remove the emperor who had tried to reverse Christianity's official status. The sources push in multiple directions, and none can be fully trusted. Julian's own bodyguard couldn't give a coherent account. The truth died with him. Julian's successor was Jovian, an officer elected by the senior commanders in the field, primarily because someone had to be emperor to sign the treaty that would get the army home before everyone died on the wrong bank of the Tigris. Jovian negotiated immediately. The terms he accepted were unconditional surrender, dressed in diplomatic language. 5 Roman provinces east of the Tigris ceded to Persia. Nisibis, the key fortress city that had resisted 3 Persian sieges, handed over its entire civilian population, ordered to evacuate. Roman protection of Armenia abandoned. 30 years of frontier construction and strategic investment gone. Ammianus Marcellinus was present during the retreat. He watched Jovian negotiate. He watched the terms being accepted. He watched the column of Nisibene civilians walking west out of their city as Persian soldiers walked in. He writes about it with the restraint of a man who has run out of ways to express how wrong it is and has decided that simply recording the facts clearly is its own form of condemnation. 20,000 Romans died holding Amida. Their emperor gave away everything they died holding. In an afternoon, Ammianus Marcellinus survived everything: the Siege of Amida, the desperate 15-mile run to safety, the retreat from Ctesiphon. He outlived Julian, who died young on the campaign Ammianus watched turn catastrophic. He outlived Jovian, who died months after his humiliating treaty. He was still alive when Valens led a Roman army to its destruction at the Battle of Adrianople in 378, the battle that cracked open the Danube frontier and sent the Visigoths into the empire in numbers that could no longer be expelled. And he wrote about that too, with the characteristic control of a man who has already seen what empires look like when they stop functioning. He retired to Rome, probably in the 380s, and found it simultaneously impressive and deeply unsatisfying. The city was still magnificent: the forums, the baths, the enormous circuses. But the senatorial class that styled itself the guardian of Roman tradition was, in his observation, a collection of people who talked about the old virtues while conspicuously practicing none of them, who attended literary recitations with ostentatious interest and immediately forgot everything they heard, who measured their social standing by the size of their dining rooms and the fashionableness of their hairstyle, and who would fly into rage if their rank was not respected at a dinner party by men who had actually fought the wars that made those dinner parties possible. He wrote the Res Gestae in this environment in his second language, in a city that was not quite home. 31 books covering the Roman Empire from the accession of Nerva in 96 AD to the death of Valens at Adrianople in 378. The first 13 are lost. The 18 covering 353 to 378 survive almost exactly the period Ammianus personally witnessed. The account of the Siege of Amida occupies books 18 and 19 in their entirety. Dense, vivid, technically precise, emotionally honest, in a way that feels almost modern. He doesn't write like a man celebrating Roman glory. He writes like a man determined to make sure that what those soldiers went through is remembered accurately, with the weight and the texture and the human cost it actually had. He is the last great Latin historian. The tradition that runs from Livy through Tacitus and Suetonius ends with Ammianus Marcellinus. After him, the literary tradition fractures and diminishes, and within a generation, it stops producing this kind of work entirely. He was writing at the end of something, and I think he knew it. He survived so the story would not die. I want to close with something that I think genuinely matters beyond the military and political history, though the military and political history is remarkable enough to justify the entire video on its own. The Siege of Amida is not, at its core, a story about how Persia defeated Rome. Persia didn't defeat Rome at Amida. Shapur II didn't break through those walls by outthinking or outfighting the Roman garrison. He broke through because one of the defenders' own improvised towers collapsed under artillery fire on day 72, and because the men defending the gap had been dying and starving and fighting without relief for 2.5 months with no help coming. He broke through because the Roman system had decided at the highest levels that giving a competent general the resources to do his job was more politically dangerous than losing the city. The garrison of Amida performed by any military standard above and beyond what could reasonably have been asked. They held 73 days against the largest military coalition assembled in the ancient world in centuries. They survived epidemic disease. They survived progressive food shortages. They survived the psychological weight of knowing the main Roman field army was within theoretical reach and wasn't coming. They improvised engineering solutions in real time. They launched offensive operations against a force 50 times their size. They gave Shapur II 30,000 dead in exchange for their city. If you put those numbers into a modern military analysis, the defenders of Amida significantly outperformed any reasonable expectation. And it meant nothing, because the system they served had already determined through its structural logic that the political management of senior generals was more important than those generals' effectiveness in the field. That keeping Ursicinus from accumulating too much independent authority was worth more than the 20,000 soldiers who died because he couldn't exercise that authority. That the emperor's comfort with his court arrangements was more valuable than the frontier those arrangements were supposed to protect. Rome fell. Not in 359, the empire would continue for another century in the west, for another 1,000 years in the east. But the trajectory that led to the fall was set by exactly these kinds of decisions. By Constantius choosing Sabinianus over Ursicinus, by Sabinianus refusing authorization after authorization while a city burned, by the imperial feedback system that rewarded political compliance and punished independent initiative until the pool of men willing to exercise independent initiative at the cost of their careers was too small to staff a frontier. This is not an ancient problem. It is one of the most consistent failure modes of large successful institutions across all of human history. It happens to militaries, to corporations, to governments, to universities, to every kind of organization that lives long enough to start selecting through its promotion and reward systems for people who are above all else unwilling to take risks and make decisions. The Sabinianuses replace the Ursicinuses. The people who are good at surviving internal politics replace the people who are good at the actual work, and the institution continues to function because institutions have enormous momentum until the accumulated gap between what it claims to be capable of and what it is actually capable of meets a real test. Amida was that test for Rome's eastern command structure in 359. And the command structure failed it completely. The walls of Amida were formidable. The legions inside them were formidable. What failed was not the fortress, and not the men. What failed was the empire's capacity to trust the right people at the right moment, which is ultimately the only capacity that matters when the wrong people are on the other side of your walls. And somewhere in that calculation, if you're paying close enough attention, there is a lesson that has absolutely nothing to do with the 4th century. Like, subscribe, and I'll see you on the next one. Julian's Persian campaign is the obvious follow-up. It is an absolutely extraordinary story. We've got a lot more history left to cover.